Federation of Canadian Municipalities, Committees, and the National Board of Directors for 10 of her 14 years as an elected official. She is a longtime advocate for all pillars of sustainable community planning, including housing and affordable housing. I hand it over to you, Councillor Kathy Jeffrey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilda. So greetings to all from around the world participating in our efforts over today and tomorrow as we exchange our ideas and experiences to find actionable and replicable initiatives. And it is our goal, and one that's being made quite clear, to make available the tools and information to small urban communities to transform into the best sustainable version of themselves and to become foundational to the world stage and its success with Sustainable Development Goal number 11. So as a municipal councillor from the host community, Collingwood, Ontario, Canada, as mentioned, council has also afforded me the opportunity to successfully pursue a seat on the National Board of Directors of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, FCM. And I am pleased to see many current and former board and committee members attending our sessions. FCM's membership is more than 2,000 Canadian communities strong, surpassing 90% representation of the Canadian population. And my role in this nonpartisan organization is to work on national standing committees and task forces and to meet with government officials to advocate with the Government of Canada on federal policy directly impacting the municipal agenda. So my past leadership roles included chairing the Standing Committee on Municipal Finance and Intergovernmental Arrangements for 6 years, during which tenures FCM successfully achieved much needed funding for infrastructure, broadband connectivity, housing, the environment, and much more. And more recently, the Safe Restart operating funds in conjunction with municipalities' respective provinces and territories to help offset the devastating financial impact on municipalities from COVID. And it also invests in replicable, sustainable municipal projects from its Green Municipal Fund, almost $1 billion seed funding from the Government of Canada. It also advocates on policy matters regarding such critical files as unity and diversity. So as former chair and current vice chair of the governance working group of FCM, it has also been my pleasure to address head-on the internal structure of FCM and its governance policies and procedures to ensure the Federation is nimble in an ever-changing political landscape and our advocacy work is actionable, relevant, and as effective as possible. So finally, as the governance representative for the Jordan Municipal Support Program, FCM's only international project in the Middle East, I work as a liaison between the FCM Board of Directors, Global Affairs Canada, the Canadian Embassy in Jordan, the Jordanian Embassy in Canada, the participating Canadian and Jordanian communities, and the FCM staff on ground in Jordan, and working in our Ottawa offices. So the work in Jordan is to assist 12 municipalities with the development and implementation of a solid waste management strategy and to increase the participation of women in their local governments. I believe that the approach and successful efforts of FCM on the Canadian international stage have already set a positive outlook and foundation for us in our work ahead. So over the next 90 minutes, you are going to benefit from the expertise of 7 keynote speakers with a wide range of topics, which will inform our work on the themes, proposed outcomes, and resolutions as our final act of the 2-day event. A short bit of housekeeping to begin. After a brief introduction, the speakers will each have 10 minutes. I will give a 1-minute notice at the 9-minute mark for speakers to wrap up their comments comfortably. If I do my job well, we will have about a 30-minute Q&A opportunity at the end. So the Q&A will first allow the keynote speakers to ask questions or comment on the presentations of each other. And time permitting, we will attempt to answer 1 or 2 questions posed in the chat by participants. So please note the speaker to which you are referring your question. So I would ask the keynote speakers to think about providing specific how-tos in the Q&A and to begin to develop the actions which will implement our visions and outcomes. So we begin. And our first keynote speaker this morning, or today in the world, is Lee Sparks. Lee is chair of Scotland's Towns Partnership and professor at the University of Stirling, Scotland. Professor Sparks is Deputy Principal of Education and Students and Professor of Retail Studies at the University of Stirling. He was a geography undergraduate at the University of Cambridge and completed his PhD on retail employment at the University of Wales. So welcome, Professor Sparks, and we look forward to your presentation.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Sorry, I was slightly thrown by the fact that I was trying to share slides and it's been disabled for me, so I'm unable to actually pass my slides over in terms of sharing them. I'm happy just to talk through if this is going to make the thing move faster for everyone. Ilda, I don't know whether you've got a comment about that or not.
Ilda, do we have the capacity to allow that?
Yes, we do. Evan, can you, or Shelby, can you enable the sharing of the slides, please? There we are.
Thank you.
Can you see it, Professor Sparks? Okay, thank you.
I can indeed. Someone's going to move them for me in that case, are they?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, many thanks. My name's Lee Sparks. I'm Professor of Retail Studies and Deputy Principal of the University of Stirling. And I've delighted to be here today, and I'm going to talk around what we've been doing in Scotland and what that might mean for towns more generally. If we can move on to the next slide, please. It's worthwhile thinking about in terms of Scotland that March was a month that changed everything for us and probably changed things for most people in the world. And a lot of things happened during a very short space of time. And in terms of what we think about now, we've got to think around our recovery in terms of what we do in terms of COVID, but also a slightly broader recovery from that as well. If I can move on, please. To the next slide, thank you. And the reason I say that is if we think about towns more generally, what we've done over the last 60 years or so, certainly in the UK and definitely within Scotland, is that we've been damaging our towns. We've disaggregated a lot of things. We've decentralized many of the things that we've been doing. Many of the activities have become very individualized. And we've based everything very much around the car. Everyone thinks around that in terms of out-of-town retailing, but a lot of the things are beyond retailing. We've decentralized cinemas, workplaces, housing, football grounds, all sorts of things. And we've sort of atomized much of our society. And that clearly has come at some cost. If I go to the next one, please. We recognise that in Scotland, certainly about a decade or so ago, and we've had a decade of action, which came out of an earlier review, which developed our town centre action plan, and that included policy directions around making sure town centre first was a principle in policy, and also more recently around the place principle. Government has recently invested very heavily in a place-based investment programme around town centre regeneration and renewal. And we've also now very much focusing over the next few years on aspects of what we term community wealth building and about 20-minute neighbourhoods. And Scotland's Towns Partnership over that period has been the national collective for towns in Scotland, very much focused around all those who have an interest in towns and promoting towns and developing a coalition to push towns forward throughout the country. If I go to the next slide. We are, though, at something of a turning point. We've had a decade of that positive sense, and that will continue. But things that have happened, COVID clearly has hit everyone badly. But in terms of certainly Scotland, I think elsewhere, it's re-emphasised the significance of place and local communities being much more important. Scotland has declared a climate emergency. We're very much of a view that towns can help deliver net zero as a consequence of that. And we're very conscious that within Scotland we have health and inequalities issues, and that place is a real aspect of how we actually respond to many of the issues we have, and all of those clearly fit into the SDGs, and towns are very much part of this solution. But to make that work, we've got to do some slightly different things, I think, that we've been doing for the last decade. If I go to the next slide. That's why when I was asked last year to do a review of where we were in Scotland's towns, we asked ourselves really three questions as part of the review. What's stopping us doing things better for town centres? Is it something we're not doing, or is it actually policy? What would encourage further and faster action? But more controversially, perhaps, what things are we doing that we should stop doing? And what should we stop supporting? And that report was published in February of this year. And if I go to the next slide, we were asked as part of that also to develop a vision, and our vision for towns became this: that towns and town centres are for the well-being of people, planet and the economy, that tripartite element, and that towns are for everyone, and everyone has a role to play in making our towns and town centres successful. We emphasised the second part of that because it was felt very much that we didn't have the right people round the table in many cases. And that vision and those questions led to these three recommendations. Firstly, that we can do some more work on policy, and we are, and that's now happening. That we also need to make sure everything is co-produced with all of the community, not just the economic part of the community, and that we rethink the data that we need in terms of data collection and use at the town level. The old stale measures that are often very narrow need to be taken away, and we need to rethink what we need to meet people, planet and the economy. The third element of the recommendations is that we expand and align funding around 4 areas: living in towns, digital towns, enterprise of different forms in towns, and green activities. And that funding needs to be aligned and sustained and of a different form, not shovel-ready projects. And that is happening within Scotland, though there is always more to be done. The second area, though, in terms of recommendations, is that the tax system, the funding and the development systems need to be reviewed for fairness to develop the outcomes we need. We privilege out of town development. We actually fund out of town development more positively than town centres. We need to reverse that if we're going to be serious about towns. We need to privilege and finance in-town development to build on what towns can offer. If I go to the next slide. And we know also that those 3 areas have been changing quite dramatically. Economy has changed fundamentally, and the graph shows the rise of internet sales as a percentage of retail sales. You see the COVID impact. We're now at almost 28%. For the economy's changed, our fundamental finance system and tax system has to change as well, and needs to change around where and how we tax. We need to think about the inequalities we see in towns and between towns need to be deemed unacceptable. How can we use all of our levers to deliver better elements of that? And recognition that the climate emergency is here today and activities we take for granted today, we're not going to be able to do in the future. And we shouldn't actually be funding many of those activities in the way that we do. A fundamental challenge and change. That second recommendation, therefore, at a national level is quite significant, but has enormous implications at a local level as a consequence. If I go to the next slide. So our argument very clearly within Scotland is that towns actually can help that recovery, both from COVID, but also very much in that longer term recovery of the damage we did in the last 50, 60 years. Towns are necessarily anti-disaggregation, anti-decentralisation. They are a focus for local distinctive communities, and that local sense of place and identity is really quite important. And towns have that ability to deliver that. And thirdly, and perhaps mostly fundamentally, they're actually the sunk costs of embedded existing resources. Towns are the most sustainable of elements. And if we build through those various areas of projects that we're developing around towns, get towns to develop that identity, that story, make sure we get the right playing field around it, then towns are absolutely fundamental to where we're going to go over the next decade or so within Scotland. If I go to the next slide. The First Minister of Scotland, as on that first slide, declared in March 2020 that we face the biggest challenge of our lifetimes and life will change significantly. That was said in the light of COVID and COVID recovery. I think those phrases are where we are now in terms of what we have to think about in our towns. We're facing the biggest challenge of our lifetime because of that climate emergency, the inequalities that we have, as well as the COVID recovery. And if we're serious about that, we're going to have to change what organisations do, what governments do, national and local, municipal, and also what individuals do. And I'm absolutely clear as my main conclusion, we won't succeed if we do the same things that we've been doing for the last 50 years, only we do them a little less badly. We really need to make sure that we actually change our behaviors. Big behavior changes of organizations, government, and people. Final slide, I think. Thank you for listening. Those, if you go forward again, thank you for listening and for helping with the slides. You can contact me in those areas. I would also say, if you don't know about Scotland's Dance Partnership, have a look at our website. One of the things you should look for is a campaign called Scotland Loves Local. And that, I'm delighted to say, 2 nights ago, our media partners in that won a national award for that campaign about trying to drive business back and communities back together in terms of the local economy within Scotland. As I said, thank you very much for listening, and thank you for the help with the slides.
Thank you very much, Professor Sparks, and I didn't get to use my bell. Great job on the timing. And thank you for really enhancing the vital roles of towns and the support that's going to be needed to allow them to survive and thrive. So thank you for that. Our second keynote speaker is Michael Fenn, is Senior Advisor of Strategy Corp, former Ontario Deputy Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, Ontario, Canada. And Michael Fenn has been a senior advisor at Strategy Corp and a consultant since 2011, following an extensive career as a public service executive. And his research publications range from infrastructure investment and water policy to housing for the elderly. As a consultant, Michael's clients extend from the municipal, healthcare, and housing sectors and to the land use development industry, Indigenous communities, policing, and professional sports. He has participated in development missions to South Africa, the Philippines, and Cuba. Michael, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Councillor Jeffrey, and I'm glad you didn't have any trouble reading my mother's resume there. Let me begin by thanking you, Councillor Jeffrey, and Mayor Saunderson and the Town Council and Sonia Skinner and her team for putting this together. I think it's an important initiative, and it's one that I hope pays dividends for all of us as well as for the town of Collingwood. I was invited to speak to this group, as you indicated, based on some of my experience largely in Ontario. And I'm going to respond to the overall question of how towns should respond to the challenges of the 4 summit themes that you've identified. Over the next 2 days, as all of us as attendees at the Urban Economic Forum, we're going to look at the role of towns in achieving the UN 7 Sustainable Development Goals. And we're going to do that in a world that's surviving the successive waves of the pandemic. I think we're all starting to realize that the urban economy of the future may not unfold at the pace or in the directions that we might have assumed. COVID has obviously accelerated many of the sort of over the horizon trends, whether they're in healthcare and retailing through to education or municipal government. Some of it, of course, can be very positive for towns. Even now, whether you're operating mining equipment remotely in the Arctic from southern Canadian towns, or working from home rather than commuting to large cities, there are exciting opportunities that are opening up for towns in Canada and indeed around the world. Clearly, the nature of the urban economy is changing. Global businesses can now operate from small regional centers that boast short, reliable, high-quality supply chains. The same economic activity also attracts talent to our towns. Urbanites seeking the collateral benefits of less expensive housing, good physical and social infrastructure, and of course, a more human scale quality of life. One of the challenges facing all of us at the Collingwood World Summit is to consider how to leverage these opportunities. Initially, you'll have to do so using governance structures that were designed for other times and for increasingly outmoded economic and fiscal assumptions. New models of intergovernmental collaboration will be needed, as was referenced earlier in the morning in the session. So how can we ensure that the fiscal supports meet those local and regional needs? Can we overcome the occasional brittleness and sterile competitiveness of our established political structures? I like to point to the COVID recovery efforts of the city managers and chief administrative officers of the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, south of Collingwood, who are collaborating and using data and analysis to develop informal cooperative ventures on issues ranging from procurement and digital technology through to transit, housing, and business taxation. I think it's clear from your 4 themes that they're the right themes for the Collingwood Summit. It's a future-oriented agenda, and I think it quite properly begins with housing. Outmigration from big cities is a real fact. It will place a strain on local housing markets and the supportive infrastructure that goes along with that. Towns will also become hosts to more immigrants and more part-time residents. While this growth confers benefits, it does not follow that everyone in town will welcome the prospect of change or disruption. Unfortunately, due to the manageable scale, physical location, and past investments of towns often have much more capacity and agility to meet these challenges than their metropolitan neighbors. When it comes to creating innovative solutions, such as was recommended earlier, towns can get everyone that should be involved around one table in a way that, as a practical matter, the big centers cannot. Unfortunately, towns don't usually have the depth of professional resources and finances of big urban centers. That shows up particularly in areas like social housing or programs for the hard to house. In addressing the needs of their disadvantaged residents, towns often lack the funding and specialized programs that support those efforts in big cities. The second theme, benchmarking, assessment, and resources, can help decision makers make timely use of evidence, science, emerging technologies, and sound economics to guide their choices, especially as funding gets tighter and options narrow over time. The summit's third theme speaks to regional and global connectivity, both digital and economic. Universal 5G mobile broadband and artificial intelligence are going to change our world in much the same way as the internet, social media, and the smartphone have already changed the 21st century. Near term, digital connectivity may be one more part of the yawning infrastructure gap for municipalities, particularly smaller municipalities, as was discussed earlier. But as it expands, digital connectivity will open up the world to economic opportunity and knowledge sharing for towns across the world. Connectivity will put towns on the same footing as traditionally more prosperous and socially magnetic metropolitan centers, but only if towns are prepared to compete both in their attitudes and in their investments. By now, we also have learned that there may be unintended or unanticipated consequences with the introduction of more robust technology into our towns. Finally, in an era of rising population, local leaders will be challenged to reconsider the nature of public participation and civic engagement. In Canada, we see this already with the widespread use of video conferencing for public meetings and municipal decision-making, where many more citizens can attend and have an equal voice. In decades past, our planning and environmental processes have evolved to cover a wide range of concerns, but now they often result in slowing or resisting decisions instead in the interest of avoiding bad outcomes. Of course, that style of public engagement imposes a cost, and it can be used simply to resist change. Those who want to build, live, and invest in our towns and cities already find many of our processes slow, expensive, unpredictable, and burdensome. They can be ill-suited to a fast-paced world competing for investment and demanding a wider range of choice and affordability in housing, for example. I think we need to re-energize our democratic processes in ways that don't just impede or avoid potentially bad decisions. We need to lay out a timely, efficient path to decisions that will prepare our communities for the demands of climate change, equity, and sustainability, and to prosper in a new, more decentralized economy. My closing challenge to you, in order to avoid Councillor Jeffrey's bell, would be this. Municipal leaders and their communities should look beyond traditional approaches to governance. We need to lift our sights from the local municipality and the municipal boundaries to the broader regional economy. We must find ways to collaborate and to share risks on a local and regional basis. But we may need to do it largely without the often disruptive effects of institutional restructuring or increasingly obsolescent commitments to past practices and past preferences. So these are big but unavoidable challenges. I look forward to hearing your solutions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that, and for really highlighting the importance of really recognizing the uncertainties that do lie ahead, and the resources that we can, as small towns, maybe turn around more quickly on to help our own cause. So I look forward to the further conversation in the Q&A. So moving on to our third keynote speaker. OJ Mcdonald is the Chief Executive Officer at the Association of Town and City Management UK, and OJ works with government ministers, parliamentarians, UK Cabinet Office, economic development professionals, business leaders, and place managers across the UK and Ireland to support town and city centres. He works on a range of policy issues, including the UK's withdrawal from the EU, tax reform, local government finance, the EU and UN urban agendas, transport, housing, planning, retail, urban regeneration, COVID recovery, and the climate emergency. Please take it away and welcome, OJ. Ilda, OJ is not unmuted. If we could.
Here we go. Got it.
Thank you.
All right, brilliant. I will share my screen. Are you able to activate screen sharing?
We can and we will. Ilda, you're muted.
Looks like that's working.
Here it comes. There we go.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Really thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you all today. And some of the themes which have already come up in the first two keynote sessions are things which are top of mind for us. So I would love to talk to you about the sustainable town and some of the things we're considering in the UK and Ireland. So ATCM, not-for-profit membership organisation, for those that don't know us, our members are those that manage towns and city centres across the UK and Ireland. So we've heard about climate change and the issues we have in terms of the climate emergency. Well, this is going to be writ large in the UK this year because obviously the UK is hosting COP26, the international summit where we will discuss climate change in Scotland, where Lee Sparks comes to you from, so in the city of Glasgow in just under a month's time. So it's something we've been thinking about in some detail. In fact, yesterday we co-hosted an international event with the International Downtown Association around the issues of climate change and the built environment. It is certainly something we are growing ever more anxious about across the UK, because we're really starting to learn about the damage which climate change is already doing to our built environment in different ways. And the fact that these problems are already emerging, and we know because of the amount of greenhouse gases that's been released into the atmosphere, there is worse to come. We know there's going to be some real challenges. In the nation of Wales, which is in mainland Great Britain, sits to the west, the issue of coastal erosion is a real challenge, and the Welsh government gets it. Their Department for Climate Change, new Department for Climate Change, now is in control of all policy around the built environment. What we've learned is that there is this key relationship between built environment, both in terms of its contribution to climate change, but also in terms of its vulnerability to climate change, which is a real twin challenge. Towns are going to have to change. We're going to need them to be environmentally sustainable. We're going to need them to adapt and adapt quickly. And we're going to need towns to do this at the same time when there are challenges around how sustainable they are economically, for some of the reasons Lee has already discussed. You know, what sits behind some of the changes we've seen in the economies of our towns is how certain services and technologies have really changed the game for a number of sectors, whether it's logistics impacting the supply of goods and whether people need to go to town to shop anymore, whether it's the cashless society, the way we communicate, the fact we don't rely on office space anymore to get work done. The labour market is far more portable than it ever used to be. The fact that we don't need to go to the cinema anymore to watch the latest James Bond movie, for example, and this can be streamed straight to the home. There are so many challenges there, and they have all been exacerbated by the pandemic. And this, from a UK point of view, is an example of some of the challenges we're seeing. So this brand, Debenhams, has been on the high street for generations. It is a household name, and this year they've confirmed that it will be on the high street no more. It is shutting its doors, and it will become an online brand only. And that is fairly consistent in terms of what we're seeing with parts of the retail economy across the UK. What we need is a proactive approach which blends environmental sustainability with economic sustainability. And that's something I think we're starting to better recognise in more and more of our towns across the UK and Ireland, because ultimately some of the best solutions out there resolve both issues. This was something in our conference yesterday, a graphic which was used by one of our climate scientists. Think about it: green jobs, livable cities, renewables, clean air, healthy children. All of those things don't just make our towns more environmentally sustainable, they just make good economic sense. Surely there's the type of places businesses will want to invest, people will want to spend time in. So the types of solutions we are looking at surely should be solving both issues. And this is not necessarily new. There's for a few years now, we've known about the link between something like green space, which is critical in terms of bringing down our carbon emissions and providing a natural defense against extreme weather events, but also well-being and footfall and dwell time and things like business investment. We can solve both issues with understanding how we utilize green space better in our urban environments. And what I want to finish off with is a case study of a town in England, which really has some ambitious plans around using green space to its full benefit. So this is a place called Stockton, which comes under the jurisdiction of Stockton-on-Tees Borough Council and is located in the northeast of England. And the population is just under 90,000 for the entire Stockton-on-Tees area. So it's a fairly small town, and it's confronted by challenges in terms of its retail economy. It has a high street and 2 shopping centres either side. And what it finds now is there's just a surplus of commercial space, which is not being fully utilised because the economy just isn't there. And the challenges is especially that Castlegate shopping centre, which you can see highlighted, unfortunately blocks access to the river for the community. And that river is a natural asset. So what the council plans to do is to open up the waterfront and provide space to that river. So they're taking the ambitious plan of just removing it and not putting in alternative space, and actually looking at consolidating businesses in the existing Wellington Square shopping centre and the north side of the high street, and completely changing the layout of this whole area to create this wonderful urban park in the middle of the town. A 40 million land bridge, riverside plaza, flexible space for events, leisure space. They're looking to start work early next year and hopefully be completed by 2025. And this goes back to something Lee said about how we have made a poor job of disaggregating various functions in our towns. Stockton want to bring it all back again: leisure centre, pool, library, customer service, hospital, council, moving in all into this area and really centralising some key functions which are important for the community in Stockton, alongside this fabulous green and blue infrastructure. And for me, the plans look fabulous, and this is what we should be doing for our towns going forward. And it is a route to both environmental and economic sustainability. That's it from me. Thank you very much. I think I survived the bell, did I? Oh,
Oh dear. Well, thank you very much for that. I had no idea the threat of the bell would be so intimidating. I mean, take your time and get all your messages across, but very much appreciate you bringing the case study for us and the visual accomplishments of what can be done, and maybe more discussion later on the processes and how that was accomplished in the Q&A. So thank you very much for that, OJ. And I love that already our keynote presenters are making connections between their presentations. So next, I'm pleased to introduce Mohamed Ridwani, Mayor of Lubin in Belgium. He has been mayor since January of 2019 and was previously responsible for, oh, sorry, I got out of order. I take that back. I want to just make sure Jeffrey Barber is unmuted. He's our next keynote speaker. Sorry about that. So you get some time to rest, Mohamed. Sorry about the scare. So Jeffrey Barber is president of Integrative Strategies Forum from Washington, D.C. Mr. Barber works with a number of civil society networks and coalitions, including as co-chair of the Northern Alliance for Sustainability, ANPED, and as Northern co-chair of the NGO Caucus on Sustainable Production and Consumption at the United Nations Commission on Sustainable Development. Mr. Barber is one of the founders of the Sustainable Development Issues Network, SDIN, for the World Summit on Sustainable Development. So welcome, Jeffrey, and I believe our tech team are ready to give the ability to share your slides.
Oh dear, which one is it here?
Jeffrey, you can share your slides. Thank you.
Get the share thing. This is up here. There we go. I'm trying to. This thing's in the way. Okay. Actually, a lot of those networks are from the past. Just a little correction there. Okay, I'd like to share some thoughts about this theme of public participation and engagement in the process of achieving sustainable urban futures, drawing on example from the city of Silver Spring, Maryland. Okay. So the mission of my organization, Integrative Strategies Forum, is to identify and foster integrative strategies to build sustainable communities locally and globally. And we see the Collingwood Summit on Habitat in Towns as an integrative strategy that is aimed at that goal, building sustainable communities locally and globally. Three elements we look for in such strategies are systemic thinking, dialogues and partnerships, and the creation of networks, coalitions, and communities of practice to implement transitions to sustainable futures. Now, ISF is based in Silver Spring, Maryland, a small unincorporated, culturally diverse city of 83,000 at the northern edge and transit gateway to Washington, D.C. Salvadorans represent the largest immigrant community, both in Montgomery County and Silver Spring, and our city is also known as Little Ethiopia, together with Alexandria having the largest community of Ethiopians outside Africa. There's few other pictures here. And this is the Salvadoran embassy, which in 2017 relocated from DC to Silver Spring. Now, the importance of diversity is highlighted throughout the summit resolution, especially in paragraphs 17, 25, and 26. And the latter lists 8 areas of diversity, calling for appropriate community-driven engagement practices. However, there are many additional types of diversity which also need to be taken into account. And underlying all of these categories is the need to reduce inequality, which is deepening even more due to pandemics and global warming. And diversity and inequality take on a multitude of shapes and dynamics within and among different towns, small cities, and indigenous communities. And in Silver Spring, which has been identified as the 5th most ethnically diverse city in the United States, participation and engagement in city decision-making is both a policy necessity and challenge. Geographically, Silver Springs is situated within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, inside the Piedmont Coastal Fall Zone and east of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And this is where Rachel Carson wrote the controversial book, Silent Spring, which led to the creation of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the rise of the modern environmental movement. As to our colonial legacy, we are located on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway Nation, which only recently in 2012 was officially recognized by the state of Maryland, yet it's still not recognized by the federal government. Now, as an unincorporated city, the Montgomery County Council is our local political authority. However, Silver Spring has its own unique social and cultural identity. Politically, both Silver Spring and Montgomery County are strongly liberal and highly supportive of many of the sustainability policies we're discussing at this summit. In turn, we are surrounded by less densely populated but strongly conservative areas, typically more skeptical of a lot of these sustainability policies like smart growth, not to mention UN programs such as the SDGs. Now, whether or not towns and small cities embrace the UN 2030 agenda or refer to the SDGs, they nevertheless confront the actual pressures and needs reflected in each of the targets of SDG 11. And in addition to SDG 11, towns, small cities, and indigenous communities face the reality of the needs and aims expressed in each of the 17 development goals. Now, in this presentation, however, I just want to focus on the role of public engagement in 2 overlapping SDGs, combating climate change and reducing inequality. The summit resolution calls for policies, practices, tools, and mechanisms to advance participation and engagement among citizens, as well as business, government, and not-for-profits. We're then inclined to ask what methods and strategies are indeed appropriate, as well as effective in reducing inequalities, not to mention the local and global impacts of climate change and pandemics, as well as the many other goals and targets of small cities, towns, and indigenous communities. Another question which many groups and communities may understandably ask: to what degree are those engagement tools, policies, opportunities, and practices meaningful or simply token gestures? So here I'd like to turn to one local case, the development of Montgomery County's Climate Action Plan, which was recently unveiled last June 23rd. Which is aiming to achieve zero emissions in the county by 2035. The process leading up to this plan goes back decades. However, a notable turning point came in 2017 when, in response to President Trump's withdrawal from the 2015 Paris Agreement, County Executive Ike Leggett loudly reaffirmed our county's commitment. Soon after, Montgomery County was first in the nation to declare a climate emergency. And ISF did its part in 2018, co-organizing with One Montgomery Green and Poolsville Green, a full-day gathering of over 80 participants representing more than 35 climate advocacy organizations and county officials to discuss their greatest concerns and suggestions for climate policies and programs, which we presented the following month to the County Council. The following year, in 2019, the county launched its formal process of developing a climate action plan, establishing 6 technical work groups made up of county volunteers with area-specific expertise, of which ISF participated in a number of the work group meetings, including the one on public engagement and education. The climate plan report gave priority to the county's ethnic diversity, putting the chapter on racial equity and social justice in the forefront, describing measures to integrate equity assessments into each of the work plan implementation strategies. Now with this, yes, you see the hateful tiny font page that nobody can read. And so while this page is impossible to read, they showed the 19 proposals for public engagement, partnership, and climate education actions which will then be vetted by the public to gather feedback and support in shaping climate engagement and outreach programs. And you can see this in more detail in the report that's on the Montgomery County, Maryland website. Now, in short, there are many different models, tools, and strategies to enhance public involvement, knowledge, and support for town and city plans and efforts to address climate change, inequality, and the various other goals and targets to be met if we are to create a sustainable future for all. Not all forms of participation and engagement are appropriate. Some amplify the problem. And in wrapping up, in deciding what participation and engagement strategies are appropriate or constructive, we should consider how different goals may be interlinked, such as combating climate change and reducing inequality. Systemic thinking about the interlinkages among goals, problems, and solutions can provide powerful multiplier effects. And so can alliances, partnerships, and networks, as we're talking about here, bringing together different perspectives, skills, and insights. And to engage the public in the process of creating sustainable futures, there needs to be a sufficient degree of trust, transparency, time, commitment, and patience, as well as timely access to reliable and relevant information and knowledge. And while there's no magic bullets or magic spells to ensure success, there are nevertheless many models and experiences which we can share and draw upon, as those provided by our fellow participants in this summit. Models and experiences which we desperately need in this increasingly complex and stressful time. Thank you.
Jeffrey, thank you very, very much. And I very much appreciated the charts which laid out your process in terms of the organizations that were involved in coming to your outcomes, and the real sheer importance of making the participation of our residents as easy and as effective as possible. So thank you for that very much. And so moving on now, for sure, our keynote speaker, our fifth one, Mohamed Ridwani, the mayor of Lubin, Belgium. And he has been mayor since January of 2019 and was previously responsible for education, sustainability, economy, and urban development. He stands for positive change and aims to turn Lubin.
Sorry, Councillor Jeffrey, if we can have Michael Etherington speak next.
Oh, for Mohamed, I am going to introduce you multiple times and we're going to know all about you. For sure, we can. Absolutely. My pleasure. So next then we will welcome Michael Etherington. He is an Indigenous Relations Consultant in Ontario, Canada. And he is currently the manager of reconciliations with the Gord Downey and Cheney Wenjack Fund, with career highlights that include TEDx talk speaker, appearing in the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, CBC, CTV, Breakfast Television, TVO, BBC Scotland, Maori TV, and season 1 feature interview in APTNS TV show Future History. Influenced by his northern upbringing, Michael has always stayed connected to community, spending much of his personal time volunteering through Passages Canada as a speaker to schools, colleges, and universities. This, along with his prior experience as an Indigenous relations consultant, cultural program manager of the Native Canadian Centre of Toronto, and trainer for the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres, have garnered Michael the personal and professional recognition as a valued speaker. And we very look forward to your comments today, Michael, and Michael needs to be unmuted.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Wajay Misway, Michael Etherington, Saskatchewan, Umshke Gundina. From James Bay, Ontario, Treaty 9 territory. And what I want to share to you with for the conversation today is with regards to the narrative of reconciliation. So my function and role within Canada, public and corporate groups are now starting to implement cultural competency models within the workplace, addressing Indigenous specific racism. And now today, they're starting to promote what's referred to as Indigenous reconciliation plans. And one theme I'd like to also speak on is with regards to urbanization, because it also speaks to my life story, because I'm from a remote community. And actually with regards to the transition from the urban to remote rural spaces, we have a jurisdictional challenge in Canada with regards to fiduciary duty of Indigenous peoples. And so I want to give a bit of a timeline of what I cover when I work with organizations. So to increase informed decision-making with engagements of Indigenous people, I want to provide a bit of an overview of the narrative in Canada with regards to the history of reconciliation. So we had one of the most damaging contemporary challenges with regards to what was known as the Oka crisis. It was unresolved land dispute between Haudenosaunee, and also what happened as a direct result, it escalated to a violent conflict. Canadian military came in, and as a result, it did result in a death, but most importantly, though, it was a stain on the Canadian contemporary narrative. So the Prime Minister of the time established a Royal Commission, which was a 4,000-page report. And then afterwards, as a direct result, they produced a statement of reconciliation, which wasn't substantive. And so it didn't really address the core of the narrative of residential schools in Canada. So many of you may have a bit of familiarity with regards to the recent discovery, May 28th, 2021 in Kamloops, BC, with regards to unmarked graves. But most importantly, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada was established from the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history, which was the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. So as a direct result, Residential School Survivors Assembly First Nation, which is a national body in Canada, culminated for this lawsuit. And then as a direct result, there were some actionable items, particularly a TRC final report, which produced 94 calls to actions, 1 to 42 dealing with legacy of institutions such as child welfare, health, education, etc., and then 43 to 94 with reconciliation actions for various other groups, particularly public and corporate. Now that statement of apology and where we are today, only 13 of the calls to action have been completed to date. So right now, some have not been started, are in progress. But I think right now, with regards to the current political climate, with regards to cross-cultural relations, it's on a decline with regards to some of the ongoing challenges with the recent discoveries, also the reference to the distinction between cultural genocide and genocide. Now, when you look at the definition of reconciliation, it is talking about establishing respectful relations. In light of the conversation about urbanization, Indigenous peoples have been historically forcibly enfranchised and assimilated into urban spaces to eliminate the fiduciary duty of the Crown in Canada. And so when we're looking at this narrative, to learn from and have supportive tools to ensure that we support Indigenous peoples in the transition to urban spaces, it's important to come from an informed place of the historical legacy. So for example, here's a map of the residential schools in Canada. There was 139 within the settlement agreement. And one marker during the formal apology, this is my late great aunt, and she was one of 4 Indigenous peoples invited to the House of Commons. by former Prime Minister Harper. And her name was Margaret Wabino, Granny Wabino, and she was the oldest residential school attendee at the time. She lived to 111 years old. The reason I'm sharing her story is because of the pathways of learning in the cross-cultural framework, her embodiment of compassion, and she was talking about the power of forgiveness, and she went to one of the most horrific residential schools in Canada, which was in Fort Albany, which was known as St. Anne's Residential School. Now, when we're looking at plans for groups and companies wanting to engage with Indigenous peoples, I established a journey of reconciliation plan. So, for example, many individuals, this is also not unique to Canada. If you're looking, for example, countries that have a colonial influence, specifically from the British monarchy or other colonial entities, I established a journey of reconciliation framework as from a preliminary, intermediary, and when you're doing advanced, having a strategic document on how you can implement effective cross-cultural processes. And so one of the preliminary things I wanted to identify was some of the information of promoting historical literacy, specifically on nation states. So for example, if we are going to promote the support of urbanization of Indigenous peoples in various spaces, we have these historical amnesia, specifically around educational reform. So in Canada specifically, there is no comprehensive education of Indigenous peoples, treaties, etc. So in the K-12 public educational system, it's important to recognize. And so in my work, I work with public corporate groups, and more specifically institutions that have fractured relations, such as the police officers. And so this quote I've identified is that if we're going to work and improve the status of relationships, we have to look at some of the ongoing socioeconomic challenges of Indigenous peoples. So if they transition from a remote to urban community, they're not an emerging middle class. Some of them may be below the poverty line. So how do you have supported organizations, cultural hubs? And so one of the most important fabrics of Indigenous supports of engagement is with regards to having cultural organizations that provide the prioritized need of Indigenous peoples. But unfortunately in Canada, we're still dealing with the legacy of assimilative policy. So this classification system, many Indigenous peoples in Canada are still bound by the Indian Act, which is under Section 9124 of the federal government. And so when you look at these challenges, we are still under bureaucratically entrenched systems. So the reconciliation process is a bit flawed because when you get down to the legalities of what's ongoing, we still have the assimilative tools and policies that are currently in place. So how do we move forward and also establish meaningful actions when we're providing support to Indigenous peoples? And so we have these actions such as land acknowledgements, and I find right now when we refer to reconciliation, it's very symbolic and gesturing. So I think the practicality about how we can move forward. So one of the references I always identify with regards to reconciliation is the South Africa TRC process of Nelson Mandela about promotion of national reconciliation. Now, one thing I want to urge to as well with some of the barriers associated with reconciliation in Canada, both Indigenous, non-Indigenous Canadians are on the verge of polarization. And so what's happening right now, there's starting to have subcultures and factions and groups starting to align with distinct needs. So we have to have a form of unity if we're going to provide meaningful support of Indigenous nations, Indigenous peoples in urban spaces, but how do we merge and bridge the gap between urban, remote, and rural? And so this is a fundamental challenge in Canada. And so, for example, where I'm from in the remote community, many Canadians, this is a public opinion report in 2016 by the Environment Institute, many Canadians still believe Indigenous peoples get special treatment from the government. Former Prime Minister Harper, 2007, has stated with impunity that there's no history of colonialism in Canada. Premier Ford in Ontario referred to saying there's no issues of systemic racism, etc. And so what I have a fundamental challenge if we're going to work effectively from institutions, specifically a municipality, how do we have elected officials continue to sway public opinion with no level of impunity? So it's important for us to ensure that we move towards truth, accountability, and justice. So whatever we're trying to apply with these aspects are starting to influence the public and cultural norm within the country. So they had some ongoing research and reports, specifically in the province of British Columbia. There was a recent report that was published called In Plain Sight. Now this report was comprehensive, and they identified the complications associated with racism that was prevalent in the healthcare system. Racism does kill because what happened as a result, Indigenous peoples who transition from remote areas to the urban spaces. They have what's called these delayed access to healthcare, the fiduciary, the crown. So they have these jurisdictional challenges. But more specifically, with regards to this report, it was around 6,000 healthcare workers were interviewed, 3,000 Indigenous respondents, and 84% of Indigenous people identified experiencing forms of discrimination in healthcare. So this, what I'm trying to identify when I say prioritized need is that we're still dealing with the symptoms of Indigenous specific racism in Canada. And so the TRC final report provided a platform about how we can move forward to address the systemic racism that occurs within Canada, but more specifically, Indigenous specific racism. So these are some of the processes that we tried to educate Canadians on regarding assimilation policies, coming from informed place of treaties, and then also how do we promote the understanding of reconciliation. So it's not a clearly defined concept. So we need appropriate frameworks and planning tools. So if we're going to implement it into the communities, what are we trying to focus on in addressing reconciliation? So if we evaluate it here, very simply, I want to close off is that fundamentally is that right now many people are trying to engage and identify information about who Indigenous peoples are. But I try to promote a concept from a restorative process of thinking. And this is how I want to close off my conversation. Where I'm from, this is a tamarack goose. And so this is from a tamarack tree. And what we have in our communities, this is very symbolic of what we're talking about the urban space, because Indigenous youth where I'm from, they think this is art. They think this is an art piece. But historically, prior generations, they were actually hunting decoys. And I think that speaks to the fundamental challenge with regards to where we're moving towards reconciliation in countries and more specifically in our day-to-day processes. So I don't want this my contributions to be focused solely on policy and programmatic recommendations. I want to speak to the heart of the country and more specifically the heart of who we engage with day-to-day, because fundamentally that's where community lies and that's where the relationships lie. And so in Canada, based upon my family's history, I could have sentiments of not believing in this country based upon my family's experience, parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents who went to residential school, but they provided a platform for us to believe that we can change. And so the treaty making process in Canada set the precedent about how we can move forward together. And this is how we can establish a meaningful plan for us to move forward, working with professional employees in urban spaces who provide meaningful support. So I'll explain this lastly to close off my contribution, but the pathway that we have for this here is providing cultural awareness and sensitivity, historical and contemporary information, cultural competence in the workplace. So how can you work effectively promoting systems of care? Indigenous communication protocol engagement is highly appropriate because it's not just reflective to Canada, it's a global concept about how do we engage cross-culturally, establish a strategic plan, and then move forward with a reconciliation plan to have milestones of what we want to achieve. Because a lot of times with my work, a lot of people think I'm going to bang drums, sing songs and feathers, but that's not, I always tell people that's not my contribution or role. We're here to have a meaningful conversation about what it means to, what reconciliation is. So I think we have to move beyond rhetoric, move beyond symbolism, but I'm very disheartened. My closing point, September 30th was the first inaugural National Day of Truth and Reconciliation in Canada, Call to Action 80, and it took discoveries of unmarked grave for that to be implemented. The final report was released in 2015. It was stagnant. So we have to do better, and we can do better, but we need to ensure that there's accountability for this. So with that being said, I just want to say Kitchi Miigwech for inviting me to share a bit of my input for this conversation of Indigenous reconciliation plans. So Miigwech.
Michael Miigwech, for such a critical conversation, and it, you know, as our mayor said at our flag raising on the 30th, is that while it's just begun, it's just such an important one to continue the momentum forward, and for us a critical lens for our conversations moving forward in our work. So again, Miigwech. All right, so Mayor Lubin, thank you for your patience. I believe that Mayor Lubin will need to be unmuted. And so not to repeat the beginning, but we do know that Mayor Lubin stands for positive change and aims to turn his community into one of the most caring, green, and prosperous cities in Europe in cooperation with the citizens, knowledge institutions, companies, and organizations. He is the inspirer of Lubin 2030, in which more than 500 companies, organizations, and citizens are united to turn Lubin into a sustainable and CO2 neutral city. He also initiated Lubin MindGate, an economic platform with 400 members that will boost Lubin as the world's hotspot for health, technology, and creativity. So welcome finally, Mayor Lubin, please, you have the floor.
Well, thank you. And
sorry, Mayor Ridwani, thank you, sorry.
no worries. Thank you. Hello to you all. I greet you from Leuven, Belgium, Europe. So I would briefly like to tell the story of how we tackle a couple of our big challenges, so to speak, or we speak about bigger dreams, where in fact we try to define a couple of the big challenges we have, and I would like to dig into the climate challenge, which is a top priority for Leuven, and where we organize the entire of the community to get the things done, so to tackle CO2 emissions, and two, while doing so, create an immense feeling of belonging, a sense of belonging, and of doing meaningful work. When, before I was mayor, I was deputy mayor responsible for sustainability. And in fact, I saw that many good things were happening in my city, if you speak about sustainability, climate policy, but it was so scattered. And the results were not as they should be. It was not going fast enough. So I convinced a couple of leaders in my city to do what has become now a governance model that was appreciated, amongst others, by the European Commission, as we were awarded the Innovation Capital of Europe. In fact, we have created a new governance model where all layers of our local society get bonded to make sure that we have impactful climate policy. We have created Leuven 2030, which is legally an NGO. It took us 1.5 years to write its legal framework. And it's a systemic approach where in this organization, each inhabitant or NGO or company can become member just by buying a member card. And by becoming member, you get into the General Assembly and you can get people elected into the board. And the mission of this organization is to coordinate all the action plans around climate in my city from all partners, and to make sure that there are a lot of experiments, that inspiration comes from our researchers, inhabitants, and startups, that they're being turned into action. The city is financing half of this organization, and half of the money is coming from all the other partners and NGOs and citizens. And over the years, this has generated so much impact. Thanks to Leuven 2030, and it exists now for 6 years. Thanks to Leuven 30, we have changed the mobility traffic entirely in Leuven, making the city center almost car-free, and changed the public space totally, and its facades and its nature has changed. While cycling, for example, it boomed by more than 40% in 3 years. Not only for the youngsters, but everyone is cycling like crazy. Of course, we had to invest in infrastructure, but the mobility plan and the pushing out of the cars I mean, it was a big deal, and there was a lot of discussion, but because we were so radically participatory in some sense, that there was a big support among our inhabitants. We invest a lot in, renewables, insulation of buildings, all that you need. And today, a lot of things move forward in Leuven, and one thing is moving backwards. There's the CO2 emissions. They go down in Leuven while the city is growing in terms of inhabitants, economic activity. We're a university city. Almost 1 out of 3 of our inhabitants is a student or a researcher. and it makes really things move forward. So again, what we have done, I think, is that one, we are very ambitious. We Leuven 2030, we said by 2030, Leuven will be climate neutral, no CO2 emissions produced on our soil. Two, we are radically participatory, and we share the ambitions. We collaborate like crazy. We share diversity and appreciate diversity. And three, leadership matters. I've heard a lot of leadership today, but empathetic leadership in all layers of our society that want to collaborate, that connect people instead of dividing them, that look forward and respect the SDGs in what they do. I think that's what we need today. So that's what we bring together in Leuven. And next to the results that we have is that it really creates a big sense of trust among people, a sense of belonging, because you're doing something useful. We don't not only have the researchers and the bright minds, but very locally in our neighborhoods, people collaborate on a very small scale by greening their neighborhoods, doing small actions, but that connect people. And that creates this sense of belonging in my city. This is the case that I wanted to present to you. Leuven 2030 is a governance model. It's not a network. It's a systemic approach towards policymaking. I think it strengthens democracy. Some of my colleague mayors say, yeah, but participation and a lot of debate is making things harder, is making policy making harder and complex, but it's not. As we have come to experience, it's not. It creates more support for your policy. And then in the end, politics has to decide. But because of this approach, I'm able to go much faster and make the transitions much faster. So once again, thank you. I will have to leave you in a minute now, but I appreciate very much the initiative, and I thank you all.
Thank you very much, Mayor Ridwani, for your very important comments, and especially noting that we can't really operate on any of the aspects of our work in silos. So your work to combine the action plans is very important, and an important message for all the other work we do. So thank you very much for that. So we sort of will lose you for the Q&A, but thank you for making time for us. Okay, so our last speaker of the keynote speakers, and I just wanted to confirm that she had been able to connect with us. Ilda, is it okay to proceed? Okay, thank you. So our last keynote speaker is Edlam Abera-Yemaru, Director of Gender, Poverty and Social Policy Division for UN Economic Commission, Ethiopia, Africa. And Edlam is currently the Chief of the Urbanization and Development Section at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, ECA. In this capacity, she leads the delivery of technical assistance to African member states in support of policies and strategies to leverage the potential of urbanization for economic diversification and inclusive growth. This involves strengthening linkages between spatial planning and economic, national, and sector policy priorities, and investments, including through long-term program and project prioritization. So please, Edlam, take it away. The floor is yours.
Edlam? Thank you for joining us. We will unmute you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. My sincere apologies. My connection dropped. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So greetings, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation to join you. My name is Edlam Abera-Yemaru, and I'm currently, I don't know whether I was introduced, but let me introduce myself anyway. I'm currently at the UN Economic Commission for Africa based in Addis Ababa. And I'm heading the work of the Commission on Urbanization and Development. So my intervention today will draw on some of the work that we're doing in this region, in this context, and how it relates to some of the issues in focus for the forum. So once again, thanks for having me here. And I do want to appreciate that this forum is specifically focused on the economic role of urbanization in cities globally. I do think that it is an aspect of urbanization and the sustainable urban development policy and practice that is receiving less attention than some other aspects. In my statement today, I will propose and posit that towns and small cities are fundamental indeed in the pursuit of inclusive growth and prosperity, but they do need to be considered within a broader framework of the national urban system. And I say this based on some of the work that we're doing in the region and some of the experiences that we have in the African continent. So I will look at the question of small cities and towns in Africa in relation to the continent's economic growth and transformation priorities. I do often feel that the debate around towns and small cities versus large cities or larger towns is somewhat unnecessarily polarized. In reality, both do matter and cannot be seen in isolation in policy, practice, and investments. We have a very similar debate around whether to prioritize rural development or urban development in the African continent, at least. Currently, just to give a bit of context, in Africa, we have around 43% of the population which is urban, and we do have the majority of our population in rural areas. However, Africa is the region which is having the highest rate of urban growth globally. So although we are not yet over 50% urban, we're urbanizing at a very fast rate. So the question of rural versus urban development is also quite polarized in the region. Now, in terms of towns and small cities in the African context, they do concentrate the bulk of our urban population. About 48% of the urban population in Africa lives in settlements with less than 300,000 people. And only 22% of Africans in cities are in urban areas with 1 to 5 million people. And so certainly the urban population in the region is concentrated in smaller towns and cities. At the same time, in our region, we observe that there is the urban primacy, whereby the largest city in a country often concentrates most of the urban population. We also observe that there is a phenomenon of the missing middle, in the sense that we have very few mid-sized cities of about 300,000 to 1 million. And if we look at the 54 African countries, only 18 of them do not have any mid-sized cities between 300,000 to 1 million. So our population, our urban population, is sort of in two extremes, mostly in small towns and cities, and then also in very large capital cities often. And so this sort of size distribution of cities in Africa has implications for Africa's economic growth, economic targets and priorities. And then I'll speak a little bit to why that is the case. So in the African context, a key priority for economic transformation is expanding productive sectors of the economy, creating more productive jobs, because 80% of employment is in the informal sector. Within this, we do want to prioritize manufacturing and services and so on and so forth. And these are primarily urban-based sectors. They're based in urban areas. And so the type of cities that we have, and whether, how well planned they are, how well they function, directly impacts our ability as a continent, our ability as countries to expand productive sectors, expand productive jobs, and so on and so forth. But beyond individual cities and how they function and how they are planned, the overall national urban system also impacts firm performance and the capacity to create jobs. And why I'm making this point is going back to what I said earlier, that when we think about city size and city size distribution, and therefore small towns and smaller cities, they exist within a larger urban system. And so what we've tried to do in our work in the African context is to look at the broader urban system, and within it, cities of different sizes. And what we have seen in the African context is that the urban system is highly imbalanced, often with a very large city, many smaller towns and cities. And connectivity between towns of all sizes is also often very weak. And so from an economic perspective, as the largest cities grow very large, they face diseconomies of agglomeration, higher factor costs, and a range of challenges. At the same time, small towns lack the factors and the productive advantages to draw firms and businesses at the required scale. So it becomes very difficult to tackle this imbalance, whereby large cities, even though they're quite dysfunctional in many ways, continue to attract firms and businesses. And small towns and cities find it difficult to compete within that context. So it's really important to look at these dynamics and look at small towns and cities vis-a-vis what is happening in larger cities, and vice versa. It's difficult to decongest larger cities because smaller towns may not, offer the desired sort of factors that may attract firms. But at the same time, smaller towns and cities, by virtue of large cities attracting much investment, may not be attracting the investment that they need. So there is, these are interconnected issues is really what I'm trying to say. And so in this kind of context, it becomes really critical to achieve a balanced national system. And what do I mean here? I'm referring to a hierarchy of primary, secondary, and tertiary cities that play complementary roles. And I want to emphasize complementarity here, because it's really one of the main points I am making here. From an economic perspective, this calls for promoting functionally complementary yet economically differentiated cities. So functionally complementary yet economically differentiated cities within an urban system, because not all cities in an urban system can specialize in the same economic activities, can offer the same economic advantages and attractions to businesses and firms and so on and so forth. And so it becomes really important to look at the whole from an integrated perspective as to what role can smaller towns and cities play from an economic perspective, what role do larger cities play from an economic perspective, and they can and they should be complementary. They cannot all play the same kind of functions and roles from an economic perspective. But again, here, the point I want to make is that cities of different sizes have complementary functions. And so the question is not about juxtaposing large and small cities and saying, let's look at small towns and cities, and that's really the priority. And I'll come back to this point. It's very difficult to have that kind of, I think, perspective without looking at the whole system. Another point I want to make, at least in our context, it may not be possible for government to invest in all places at the same time. So the sequencing of investments in cities of different sizes is really quite important, given resource constraints, and choices have to be made. Unfortunately, no country, I would say, can uplift every city and town simultaneously. And so investments need to be prioritized and sequenced. And so there's some thinking that needs to go into that, depending on the priorities of that country. Certainly in the African context, again, going back to the debate as to whether to look at, to focus on the larger cities or the small towns and settlements, our largest cities are actually such a critical anchor for our national economies. And they concentrate a disproportionate volume of our economic activities. So diverting investments and budgetary support away from our largest cities in African countries might actually be detrimental to our national economies. So again, I think it should not be a polarized question. Investing in our largest cities is essential, But at the same time, cities and towns of a smaller size should not be forgotten, should not be left behind. And the question is, what kind of investments then should we put into smaller towns and cities, considering the resource constraints, considering the need to prioritize and target investments in different locations? But as I said, neglecting prime cities is actually also quite risky in our context. So to conclude, there is no question about the importance of small towns and large cities and cities, small towns and cities from an economic perspective. They offer considerable opportunities. Most growth in Africa is going to take place in small towns and settlements. And we do have an opportunity to ensure sustainable growth pathways, because most of the urbanization is not happening. But I do want to say again that a focus on small cities and towns in isolation from the broader national, urban, or even spatial system may not be relevant or even desirable in certain contexts. So a whole of system approach is especially needed in contexts of resource scarcity, where prioritization is mandatory. And certainly the current pandemic has placed cities of all sizes at the center of the global debate once again. And it is now ever more critical to consider how to bring cities to the center of development policy and practice. And I would say small cities and towns definitely are critical in this, but it's also important to look at the dynamics and the role and function of prime cities as well. So that's the perspective I wanted to share from our region. And back over to you, Councillor.
Thank you very much, Edlam, for some very critical points in your message. And I love to highlight the one regarding the dynamics between rural and urban, and the differentiation, and your interesting thought on the sequencing of the investment in the two to come with the best result for our communities. So thank you. So that brings us exactly to have our 30 minutes Q&A session. And I would ask Ilda, I'm assuming that we will unmute all of the keynote speakers simultaneously here. And I think the approach we may take with the keynote speakers that were able to remain for the Q&A to maybe take a conversational approach. I know that I saw a question from Professor Sparks in the chat, which I will let him maybe present personally through our Q&A session to the other speakers. And I'm sorry, Professor, but I forget who it was directed to. Maybe we will kick off the session with that question if once Professor Sparks is unmuted.
Happy to repeat the question. I fear, though, the question was would have been best answered by the keynote speaker who's actually not with us.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Which is the problem, but it might be worthwhile saying as well, I was taken by Lubin, which is a place I know as well, that the demographics of Lubin are a particular type. The participatory approach they adopted was a particular type, and they, I think, have a particular strategy. And if I contrast that with some of the things that have gone on in the UK during COVID about closing roads and changing the centres of places, it's been more piecemeal, certainly here, but many of those are being reversed now because of lobbies being against, the media being against road closures. And I'm curious about the extent to which Lubin's success is due to the participation, the demographics. A university town will have different feelings, or to do with the fact it was a coherent strategy over a period of time. And I sort of pose the question more broadly, perhaps, is to what extent are you working with people, or is it a battle against some of the institutional issues that stop things happening? And how do we tackle that in different places?
And thank you for facilitating and broadening that to allow our other keynote speakers to maybe address. Do we have one of our speakers who would like to respond? OJ, would you like to respond? I see you're unmuted.
I guess I can't answer Lee's point directly, but what I can say is to back up what he says. We had a meeting with our parliamentary group here in the UK, our group of MPs, about this very issue and some of the changes we saw on our streetscapes in towns during the pandemic. So I think it was 2 cities and 1 town we had as speakers. And it was quite clear that in some cases where those changes to reduce traffic, to open up streets, was pushed forward and there was less consultation and there was some anger around that. Now that the public health situation has changed, a lot of those streetscape changes are being reversed because clearly there was a great deal of unhappiness around the way some of those changes took place. So I had the very same question as Lee. Is the process of participation, almost taking a more democratic approach to some of these changes, the route to making them more longer term, giving them a platform for a legacy, which means they can remain as consistent? And then does that point us towards how we make our towns more sustainable and better equipped to fight the climate emergency? Do we need a participatory approach in order to be able to do that? It's a really big question. I don't have the answer myself, but Lee's asked the right question.
Okay, thank you. And I would also ask, please to unmute Michael Fenn.
Thanks, Councillor. I guess I was going to throw the ball over to others. One of the observations that I've made is there was a lot of ameliorating of the situation, particularly in downtown or high street areas, in terms of allowing more bike lanes and narrowing traveling lanes for vehicles, bump outs to allow patios and encroachment on municipal property, a lot of that kind of thing. And my observation is they happened a lot faster than they would have in the old days. As was said, with a lot less public consultation, I suppose, in some respects, although online consultation seems to have facilitated a lot of things that in the old days would have involved a lot of scheduling meetings in evenings and things of that kind. So I was even wondering whether our Collingwood hosts had any perspective, because my observation is there'll be pushback. I mean, the merchants were particularly affected by COVID, particularly the restaurants and some of the hospitality business. And so they were understandably very sensitive to anything that would further encroach on their economic viability. But I guess my conclusion was this is a case of 3 steps forward, 1 step back, that there have been reversals in spots, but a lot of what was experimented with proved to be a good proof of concept and will in fact be retained. But I'm not the expert on this. Maybe the Collingwood folks would be in a better position to comment.
Well, certainly we had a lot of experience with that. I'll ask to unmute Mayor Saunderson. And I know Mayor Saunderson will be able to speak to the successes we had and our abilities to turn some things around pretty quickly.
Thank you, Councillor Jeffrey, and to the panel. It's a great question, and I think it goes to the point about local nimbleness. We certainly saw local BIAs and businesses band together for local initiatives. In Collingwood, we had a local task force on economic recovery after the first wave, which generated 35 recommendations that covered quite a gambit, from looking at a shop incentive program, but doing things like opening streetscapes for retail. So having patios extended so that outdoor dining and gatherings could happen, creating a local code of responsibility for shoppers, making sure that there was an understanding of what was expected by our shoppers and by our retail sector in terms of PPE and shopping practices. Digital Main Street, working with our local businesses to give them an online platform as well for their retail businesses. Certain sectors thrived, others were very much prohibited and damaged, going to our restaurant sector and our hairdressing, beauty salon, fitness clubs. They were under much different restrictions. The town did try to facilitate some outdoor activities for our local fitness clubs so that they could use the parks for outdoor exercises, which they couldn't do indoors. But certainly, I think what we saw locally and regionally was that municipal governments and our local businesses were much more interactive in trying to work together to support our economies and our businesses. So I think what it really taught me locally, and I think our council, is the importance of regional collaboration in trying to create a local circular economy where we were patronizing businesses, not just in Collingwood, but also in the surrounding area, and encouraging our businesses to use supply chains in the local area as well. So there was a lot of thought that went into it, and I think it's still very much evolving.
Thank you very much, Mayor Saunderson, for addressing that. Did we have anyone else who wanted to weigh in on that specific topic, or do one of our keynote speakers have another matter they'd like to address in the conversation with their colleagues? OJ, if we could unmute OJ, please. Mcdonald.
Hi, thank you. I don't know if Michael Etherington is still with us.
No, he had another commitment at 11:30.
Oh, that's a shame. No, it was a question for Michael I had around the role, given everybody's favorite social media platform has been in the news recently, Facebook. The role, given what we learned from the whistleblower, what role social media plays in terms of social conflict in our towns, especially with regards to the promotion of racism and hate speech. So that was the question I had for him. It's a shame he's gone.
Okay, all right. Well, maybe we can find a way to link you with Michael to have some feedback from him in that. Any other conversations that we would like to have as part of the question and answer? I think if we maybe go back to some of the presentations in terms of, it was very interesting of the dynamics between urban and rural, and Edlam's comment regarding the sequencing of funding, and a number of things for me come into play, and I don't know how it is in other countries or communities. In Canada, we enjoy a very strong partnership through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and the large cities, Toronto, Vancouver. We have them in Big City Mayor's Caucus, very much support the messaging of our rural, northern and remote communities as part of the whole national economy. So I'm wondering, you know, that was kind of a totally different dynamic than what I've become used to and being able to work within in Canada. And I'm wondering if there's other input as to how that works. And I'll just leave it at that for now, if that's a question that our keynote speakers believe they could have. I have someone waving from iPad. Are you wishing to speak, sir? Okay. If we could unmute, there we go.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, if you could introduce yourself, that would be great. Thank you.
Hassan Bendaman from Montreal, ex-UNEP staff member, United Nations Environment Program. And I've noticed that almost all the speakers insist on the need for change. We cannot continue doing business as usual because of the COVID momentum, but also because of the urgency of the climate change that is coming upon us. In addition, of course, to the population growth, which is exerting increased pressure on the governance of the city environment. And I wonder if thought has been given to the open spaces in the urban environment to accelerate the change to the extent that when you have open spaces like parks, like games, whatever games, it can be soccer, it can be hockey, whether it be museums or festivals, people discuss and they are able to get out of the non-partisan or get out of the partisan positions, and they cheer the performers or whatever as a community, not as, well, to use the typical case of the US, Democrat or Republican, just citizens enjoying and appreciating something common, and that forges the unity of the population. The other thing is the other skipped my mind, but when you have people expressing a common position, they can get out, liberate themselves from the, now the idea is come, sorry. The social media has played a very important role in enforcing the bias and the partisan positions of people, because they are isolated in their little living room with their screen, and the social media is making a profile of people and feeding them more arguments to show them that they are right, and they are in the comfort zone of that kind of feedback from the social media, and they don't have the time or the opportunity to confront their positions with others in society. And I'm wondering if the social dynamic of the city can counter that kind of social media entrenchment of people into unique and individualized and biased positions.
Thank you very much for your comments. And I don't know if any of our keynote speakers would like to weigh in on that conversation. I know that mental health has become a huge part of our work in small communities, and the impact of the migration from large urban communities to our green spaces. You know, we were almost overrun in some Canadian communities. So very valid points. I'm not seeing any hands from other keynote speakers. Oh, yes, Professor Sparks, if we could please unmute Lee.
Just a quick comment. I'd agree with much of what was said, and also what the comment that's just appeared in the chat as well. Open spaces and green spaces are absolutely vital. I think we've mismanaged those, and we need more of those. I am negative about aspects of social media, and I recognize the thing you're saying. I would also say, though, that in some of the responses to the pandemic, and also some of the participatory elements we might think about, networks via social media are actually quite important. So I think and actually are quite beneficial. Where I think there is a point, and to join both your open space and your social media, is what we really need to figure out is how can we puncture bubbles, so that when people are in private bubbles, how do we actually get things through that are different and different opinions in the right way? And I think space and community action, community places can be much more important around that. And that's an opportunity, I think, for centres of towns in terms of making those spaces better, and also having those community assets and community buildings much more open, much better as a consequence. So it's some sense, I'm agreeing with you in some parts. And I think we just need to do a lot more about that. I think we're recognizing the importance.
Thank you very much. There was an interesting question in the chat that I saw briefly, is what is the definition of rural? And there are many definitions. I think it depends on where we're participating. I believe I saw earlier today for the UN, it's 50,000 and under within our small town definition. I know at FCM, our rural form is made up of municipalities of 100,000 and under, which really surprised me. I didn't think Collingwood at 26,000 would be considered part of the rural forum. So is there discussion to be had as to, in our work, maybe just to validate that, our definition of what that population for rural or definition is. Anybody want to respond? If we could unmute Michael Fenn, please.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that people find with defining rural is it can often depend on how far you are away from a metropolitan area. Certainly, I've lived in northern Canada, and a relatively small town was a major center because it supplied a pretty broad area surrounding it. Other places are reasonable commuting distance from a metropolitan area, and that gives a different kind of dimension to what a small town has in terms of range of services and economic viability and the makeup of the population and all that kind of thing. So I think one of the contributions that some of the institutions that look at defining that, whether it's FCM or some of the university-based institutions, when they define rural, often they distinguish between sort of immediately suburban, mid-distance, and remote. And that makes a big difference in terms of what's considered a rural community.
Thank you very much for that answer. We have a request in the chat to hear from OJ about how the climate change entity in Wales is the regulator or lead for the built environment, and what the other panel members think about that approach. OJ, start with you.
So yeah, just to explain, so the way it works is in the UK, we've got a little bit of a weird political system. Technically, the UK government has responsibility only for certain parts of the UK. UK government has full responsibility over England, but it's only in issues such as some of the national tax, defence, security, etc., where it has responsibility for Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. In Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, we have devolved governments in each. And for Wales, the government of Wales, with its own assembly, is able to control its own policies on something such as the built environment, housing, town centres, planning policy, for example. And it's here where the Welsh government has taken the exceptional measure to turn this particular department into the Department for Climate Change, and everything around planning policy for the urban environment and everything that impacts towns and cities now goes through this Department for Climate Change. It's a really interesting concept, and to my mind, this is the first instance of this that's happened in the UK. Now, what that means is a lot of the policies we see coming through in terms of the built environment are being taken with a climate change lens on them. So I think it would have been last week, the Welsh government announced that in terms of planning policy, all new development now in terms of our built environment has to take into account issues around flooding and the rising sea levels and what impact that will have on certain areas of the Welsh landscape over the next few years. That change is to come into play from December onwards. So from now on, all new developments, it looks like in Wales, cannot take place on the coast because of the threat of flooding in the future. I was actually told today that Cardiff, which is the capital of Wales, is probably the city most at risk from flooding in the UK. So now what we're going to see is all aspects of the built environment in Wales, all decisions will be taken with a climate change lens on it. So that's to give you a flavour of how it's meant to work. So I don't know if that makes it clear. And if anybody has any comments on whether that's good, bad, or whatever, what they think about that, I'd love to hear about it. We've got a meeting with the Welsh government in a week's time to discuss more about how we work together on this.
Thank you for that response. Do we have others of our keynote speakers who would like to weigh in on that, that conversation? I'm not seeing any. I know that Jeffrey Barber put comments into the chat, which you can see there. Okay, I'm just doing a time check here. I think we have about 7 minutes. Ilda, did you have anything, housekeeping or wrap that you needed to do before the lunch at noon? Or should I take another question?
You could take another question if there is, and then I can do some housekeeping, or maybe just do final closing remarks.
Yeah, so in closing, I really want to thank such an impressive league of keynote speakers today with some really critical, important parts that will be able to inform some of the decisions and the resolution matters that we have before us, and also really to inform the conversations we can have within the thematic portions of the sessions today. So it's been my privilege to moderate this session today, and I wish you all the best in the rest of the summit and in your work in your homes. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to Ilda.